Hey everyone, welcome back. In the last video we hooked up a database to our application or our project, and we were able to get partially what we wanted to get back in terms of user data. But if you recall, just by looking at our schema, that what we wanted to get for a user when we opened up our GraphQL playground and did a query on users, all users, we wanted to get the user ID, the username, their email. We didn't need to return their password, of course. That would be a security issue. And then, of course, we had wanted to originally get a list of projects that user was assigned to. So we're going to finish that up today. Right, so to help us out a little bit, to make things go a little bit more quickly, I've got a gist here. Actually, that's not the gist. This is the one here, and I'll put a link to it in the description below the video. And that's going to give us most of the code we need to add to our utils.js file to get us through this video. But for now, go to your code and go to your db.js file, your database, or where we're bringing in our database. Of course, we're not using this anymore. We don't need it. So go ahead and get rid of that. Now, up until now, or at least from the last video, we'd been importing this client and then activating that every time we wanted to make a query. We were just basically connecting the client here and then using it to make our queries, say like here. And in cases where we were adding data to the database, we were closing the client. But unfortunately, if we had a function where we had two queries run in succession, if the first query closed the client, then that would make the second one impossible. All right, we could keep opening it back up, but apparently, that's costly to do that every time. So what we can do instead of doing that is, rather than using client, we can use pool. All right, and the pool basically will give us a pool of client connections, and by default it gives us 10. And then when we run a query, it'll grab an available client connection, it'll open it up, it'll run the query, and then it'll release that client connection back into the pool for use again by another client, or by another request, or for another request. So all we need to do is change this here to pool, and this to pool. And then in our utils.js file, we'll import not client but pool. All right, and then throughout our file, we'll just have to change all the clients to pool. Of course, we'll just want to do this to every instance of client. So Control F2 and change those all to pool. All right, and then just do a quick check to make sure you don't have any client references in the file. Everything looks good. All right, so again, what pool does is it has a pool of 10 client connections, and when we make a query using pool.query, and this is a special case, if we use pool.query, we'll grab the first available client connection, we'll open it up, we'll make our query, and then when we're done, it'll be released. So we don't need this. Or that. Okay. So that's the first thing we want to do. Now, if you look at my pgadmin, you can see that I've basically dropped all of my tables. get rid of the references up here. So you can see for my database, which was TSGQL, I've dropped all of my tables. That's because we're going to recreate them. We were talking about, or we wanted to, according to our schema, have it so that our user object would have a list of projects, right? But remember, this is our GraphQL schema, right? So it's a type def in GraphQL. Our database isn't going to look like this, right? And we're not actually going to store an array of projects in the database, right? Because if we did that, we would have to store the full project as, for each element, we would have to store the full project, which includes all of this, which means if we were writing data to a table called projects and then also writing that same data to the users table, it would just be putting in way too much code, using up way too much memory, and just it would be very inefficient. So what we'll do is we'll create a relationship between the two tables that we create. One table will be user table or users, and one table will be projects. And then we'll use that relation to grab the data that we need and bring it together, and then create a user object that is in the shape of our type definition here. All right, so I know that's a lot of talking. Let's just get to it. So the first thing we want to do is create a table, and we want to create our users table, and we want to change things up a little bit here. So firstly, if you go to that gist I just showed you, you can see there is a function called create user table. So if you grab that and then add it to your code, in fact, you can just get rid of all of this, or just replace it with that new function. Now you see here I've got this function called read query, and I'm using this because there's basically, you've noticed that we have this try catch thing going on, and we use the same code several times. So rather than write it a bunch of times, we can just make a function and then call it every time we need it. So that function is called read query, and it's right here. So grab that. We'll put that at the very top. Also, we don't need this anymore. All right, so you can see now that we call read query here. All right, so we want to change, we want to create our user table, and you can see that I've changed it a little bit. Instead of using an integer for the user ID, I'm using a string, and I don't remember if I made it the primary key before. I think I did. But this string isn't just going to be something that we think of and create. We're going to use a package called UUID, all right, and that will give us a random string that will act as our user ID. So what you want to do is import the package UUID, right? And if you, and maybe I don't remember, so let's go to the npm web page. All right, here it is. All right, so it's an easy install. Now also remember, because we're using TypeScript, we're likely going to need a package that helps us out with our UUID package. So if we look up that, just type in TypeScript UUID, and it shows us that npm package we're going to need. So it's this one right here. So we'll add that too. Okay, and then usage is pretty straightforward for UUID. If you just grab this right here, and you can see what it returns is this string. All right, and that's what we'll be creating for our user IDs. And it does this, using some pseudo-random generator. And I guess the likelihood of ever having a repeated ID is extremely small, so this is considered very safe. All right, so we're bringing it in there and we'll use it here like this. Okay, so now we're just creating our table, so let's go ahead and do that. So all we need to do is run this function, create user table, and let's run it from our index.ts file. Remember last time we had all this garbage, you can just get rid of it. We also don't need the client anymore. For now, we'll just bring in the create user table function. All right, and we'll need to run our dev server. All right, so let's go ahead and try to insert that. And hopefully that created a table for us. All right, so go over to your pgadmin, refresh your tables, and you can see we've got that users table. And it has the corresponding columns that we need, right? Our ID is now a string. Our name is a string as it was before, so is the email, and so is our password. Okay, so we've got a table for users. Let's go ahead and create a function that adds users. Actually, we did that last time, right? But we're going to change things a little bit. So again, go back to the gist that I created. And get the add user function. And replace the one you have in your utils.ts file currently. All right, so let's go through this. Basically, what we want to do is we want to first find out if there is already a user with the email address of the person trying to register, the person we're trying to add to the database. And we'll use a function called find user by email, which I have also in my my gist, so grab that. It's right here. And go ahead and put that just under read query. Actually, don't do that. We'll do that for now. And then these table creation functions, since we're only ever going to use them once and actually probably can move them to another file at some other point, just put this at the bottom of the file. Alright, so we have our find user by email function, and let's get rid of this for now. All it does is it takes the email of the person you're trying to add, and then it goes into the users table and it tries to find a user with that email address. All right, and then what it does is it returns the response. And remember, the response will be an array of JavaScript objects, or array of objects, and that array is called rows. Right, so in your add user function, what it'll do is it'll take the result of that query, right, which is res.rows. It's an array of objects. And if that array is empty, which means its length is 0, right, then what it'll do is it'll add the user. That's what it's doing here. And then if for some reason that we can't even think of, the user doesn't get added, right, it just goes into here and nothing happens, right, like say this is not true, then it'll just tell you unable to add user. And of course you can do some more sophisticated error handling later. This is just something simple to get us by. All right. Now, one thing to look at is we're not being very specific with our types, and this list tables things right here isn't really necessary. We're just looking directly at our PG admin anyway. So let's put this down to the bottom of the file. So for example, this find user by email. Right, basically what we're returning is an array of users, right? So for example, what we could do, since we're using TypeScript, is we could actually make a user type. Right, we've done that already in GraphQL, but we can do one also in TypeScript. So we can say interface user, and then our user, and this is the user in the database, not the user according to our type defs in GraphQL, would have an ID, which is a string, would have a name, which is also a string, would have an email, which is also a string, would have a password, but we're not returning passwords here. Well, let's do this anyway. Right. And also remember, our user would have a list of projects according to our schema, but we're not adding the list of projects to the database, so don't worry about that here. All right, so now if we look at this function find user by email, we know that it's returning a list of users. So we can be specific about the return type. Right? For example, if you just hover over find user by email and you're using VS Code and you have the right extensions put in, for example, if you have all right, that's weird. I don't know why it's not coming up at the top. Okay, so for some reason I don't actually have I don't know what I'm thinking. I think maybe TypeScript is already part of VS Code. Let me take a look at the VS Code TypeScript docs. And actually you can see that VS Code includes TypeScript language support, so I don't know what I was thinking. I thought you would need an extension, but I must have been thinking about something else. Anyway, because of VS Code having TypeScript language support, you can do things like hover over this function and it'll tell you what the return type is, right? And right now there's just sort of an implicit array of any, right? Now, because this is an asynchronous function, we're using async await here. It's returning a promise, right? It's returning a promise and with an array of type any. Inside of it could be an array of objects, could be an array of strings, right? And the reason why it knows that it's an array of something is because of right here, right? For example, and you can see the query result that's being listed. If I change this to a string, like say hi, and then I go back and hover over here, you can see what the return type has changed, right? It either returns a string hi or it returns a user object, basically. Right? So what we could do is we could set a return type of user, since we had the user interface. We put in the user interface up here, right? We could say, actually what you could try to do right off the bat is you could just say, I want to return an array of users. TypeScript isn't going to like that, right? And it'll tell you that, or it'll ask you, did you mean to write, the return as a promise with an array of users? And of course you did, so you can just go to quick fix and you can replace user array with promise user array. Okay, and down here I've specified a sort of default return, but if I get rid of this, or if I just comment it out, then you can see TypeScript again doesn't like this, alright? And what it's going to tell me is that I don't have a default return type. Right, so it says that if I don't have, or sorry, the default return type is undefined. So if I don't have some specified return type, it's going to return undefined. So in my return statement, I would have to say that, right? So I could say here, either return a promise where it's an array of users or undefined. Right, I can do that, and then TypeScript stops complaining. Right, but really, I may come back a bunch of times and change what the user looks like inside of the database. I may add some columns. Right, and eventually if I do that, I'll have to change this over and over and over again for every time I update the structure of the table. So for now, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and leave the return type as it was, and that was just a promise with an array of any's, for lack of a better way of putting it. All right, and I'll leave this in. All I'm doing with this here is I'm saying that I'm trying to find a user by the email, and I'm returning the array of users. And if I don't find a user with this email, that array should be an empty array, which means its length should be 0, right? And then I should add the user, right? But in the case where I don't have, like if this doesn't work, as a default, I want to return an array of a single object, and that'll make sure that it doesn't try to add the user, because it looks like there's a user there. Alright, so if that doesn't make sense, just take some time to look at it. Also, one thing we've changed since last time is now as the user ID, we're not using an integer anymore, we're using the UUID ID string. Alright, so with that, let's go ahead and try to add a couple of users, and they'll be the same users we've been dealing with up till now. So go back into your index.js file, bring in the add user function. Alright, so the first user was our friend Octavio. Email was oflores@zcorp.com, and give them a password of ABC123. All right, so before we run it, let's just double check. All right, all we need to pass in is the name, email, and password. All right, and we can see that here. So let's go ahead and run that and see if we can add the user. All right, we've got an error here. And it's easy to see why we got an error. I just forgot to put a comma right here. Okay, and the user's added. Right, and let's add the other user, our other friend, Sarah Bennis. All right, and the user was added. So let's go to our pgadmin. Refresh our tables. And let's look at our user table again, or our users table. All right, so you can see we've got our two users here. All right, now our ID is the UUID that we created using the UUID package that we imported. Okay, so we're no longer generating just integers. Okay, so back to the code. All right, next we'll want to create a projects table. All right, so just like the user table, we'll need a function that creates a projects table. We could do this in the pgadmin, but let's just do it programmatically. So if you go to the gist that I have, I have a function here called create project table. Let's copy that and put it in the file below our create user table. All right, and this function also depends on the read query function, but that's okay. So for our create our projects table, we're using as our ID this serial here, which will give us an integer, and what it'll do is every time you create a new project, right, it'll assign an ID by the next integer up, right? It'll auto increment to the next integer, so +1 each time. All right, we could use UUID or some other scheme to generate project IDs, but for now we'll just go with this, and we're making it the primary key. All right, and then the only other things we need for the project right now is the title and the status. If we go back to our schema, right, we see that we have the ID, the title, and the status, right? One thing you can see that maybe right away we should change, especially for our users, this is no longer going to be an integer, right? This is going to be a string. Project itself will still be an integer, right? We're not going to include this, right? Again, that's something we'll get using table relations. Okay, so we should be able to create a projects table now. So let's do that. So import that. Okay, and run it. And if we go to our PG admin, see what's going on, refresh our tables, we see we've got that projects table there. And it has the ID, title, and status. Okay, so that worked. Let's go back to our code. All right, so we've added a couple of users. Let's go ahead and add some projects. So again, and I don't think we did that last time. So you can just grab the function from the gist that I created. And we'll be doing that for most of this video. So here we go, add project. We'll put that under add user. Alright, so we're not doing anything special here. We've just got our SQL query. Since we're inserting values as variables, we'll use these placeholders that we looked at last time. And again, we don't need to insert the ID, it'll be auto-generated for us. Okay, everything looks all right. If we're successful, we should get this message here. So let's go to our index.ts file. Bring in that function add project. Alright, so we just need a name and a status. Right, those are the only two things we need. Right, just these two right here. So the first project, I think last time we called it site upgrade. And we'll give it a status of active. Let's add it. We've got a success message. Let's add another project. Alright, this will also be active. Okay, so that worked. Let's do a couple more projects. Let's make this one completed. Of course, we wouldn't add it as already completed, but we'll just set that status right off the bat. And then one more. What should we do? Okay, so we just tried to add 4 projects, and if we look at our database, we should see, or our table of projects, we should see them there. So refresh. Okay, good. So we've got our 4 projects, right? And we see that the project ID has been auto-incremented by 1. These are integers. So that serial worked for us, right? In Postgres, I think serial is unique to that, and you use auto increment in, say, MySQL. I'm not quite sure about that. All right, good. So we've added some users, we've added some projects. Now what we'd like to do is, again, the ultimate goal is to get a list of users to where we have their ID, their name, their emails, and also a list for each user of projects they're involved with. So what we can do is we can create a table of assignments, right, where we assign a user to a project, right, and maybe eventually we could add a column so that we could record the date on which they were assigned, maybe the date which they were removed from the project. Right, but for now we'll just create a table called assignments. Right, and I have this function here called create assignments table, or create assignment table. So put that below create project table. All right, so again, we're using serial for the ID so that it can auto increment. Now that will be the assignment ID. All right, now we're using the project ID from the projects table, and we're also using the user ID from the user table, or the users table. All right, and these foreign keys are used to reference these values so that the relationship gets established, right? And not only that, we're setting a primary key pair, right? We're saying that both the project and the user ID are, as a pair, the primary key. So if I add a project ID, like say for example, you can see here, right, for our projects, this project site upgrade has an ID of 1, but I should be able to add as many members or as many users to that project as I like. Say for example, I have 3 people working on it. I would like to have 3 people assigned to this project, right? So that means that here the project ID can be repeated a bunch of times, but the user ID and the project ID, if I already have assigned that user and both of these are already in an assignment, then it'll throw an error. It'll say you can't do that because you're trying to repeat something, so that removes the possibility of assigning someone to the same project twice, right? If we did this on our own, just programmatically, we would have to do a query. We would have to loop over the whole database and check to make sure that for a certain project ID, that user ID wasn't already attached to it. So this makes things a little bit more efficient for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that table. Okay, so let's make sure that our table was created. Refresh. Okay, and we see we have our assignments table here. Okay, so we have our ID, which is the assignment ID, right, for the table. We have our project ID and our user ID, which as a pair make up our primary key. And then of course we have the username. So each row represents an assignment of a user to a project, right? And again, we can add more columns later that mark, say, the day that the user was added and the day that the person was released from the project, for example. All right, so let's go ahead and make some assignments. So we'll need a function. So I keep going back to the code, but I should be careful to grab the function we need from the gist. So we'll need this function here, add assignment. So underneath add project, paste in that function. All right, good. So what's required here is we need to add the project ID and the user ID, right? Now the project ID, we'll go ahead and include that ourselves. We've only got 4 projects, so that's not a big deal. In the future, we might find some other way to add the project ID, like look it up by its name and then add its ID that way. Unfortunately, you have the risk of adding 2 projects with the same name. You know, maybe somebody forgot to change the date or something like that. But for now, we'll just add the project ID in manually. But the user ID, we don't want to enter in manually because it's that big ugly string that we get from UUID. So what we can do is we can first do a user ID lookup, right? And that's what we do here to get the user ID. And we use the user's email to get the ID because we know that each user there should only be one user with that specific email in the system. Right, so we input the project ID, the user email, and the user name. We use the user email to find that user and get their ID. Right, so once we do that, we check to see if there is that user. If there's no user, if that array like res.rows has nothing in it, has a length of 0, then we get an error message here. Or we just basically assign the ID of that user to this value, user ID, and then we'll use that to insert our assignment into the table. Right, so I'm probably not doing a great job of explaining it, but take some time, just look at the function. I'm sure that you'll see that it makes sense when you use it. Right, so we should be able to, with this, add a few assignments to the table, so let's do that. All right, so again, first we need the user email, the project ID, and then the username. So email, ID, and name. All right, so we'll add Octavio first. So that's O Flores at zcorp.com. All right, we'll add him to the project with the ID of 1. All right, that was our site upgrade. And then add his name. And that's just for easy reference. Let's go ahead and add it. That worked, or appears to have worked. Now we'll add our good friend Octavio also to the project number 2, right? Which was what? Add a new login form, something like that. Okay, and that created that assignment. Now remember, we had our primary key set up as a pair, project ID and user ID, so that if both of those were already present in another assignment, we should get an error. So let's try that quickly just to make sure it works. So let's try to add them again to the site upgrade project, project number 1. Okay, there's our error. And you can see here, right, duplicate key value violates unique constraint. Okay, so that part of it's working. Right, now let's add our friend Farah to the site upgrade project. So now, even though we're using the same project ID, since she has a different user ID, we should be able to add her. And it looks like we are. Right, now let's add her to project 3. Whatever that was, I can't remember. Good. And again, if we try to add her back to project 1, we should get an error. And we do. So it's a duplicate key error. All right, and let's add neither of them to project 4. All right, just they're not involved with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our assignments table, just to make sure they're in there. Refresh. Okay, good. All right, so we can see that for project 1, right, we have both Farah and Octavio added. For project 2, we have only Octavio, and for project, it's Octavio, I don't know, I keep calling him Octavio. And for project 3, we have Farah, right, and not Octavio or anyone else. And then we don't have any references to project 4, right, since nobody's been assigned to that yet. Okay, so back to the code. So again, remember, our ultimate goal was to get the users and return them, right? Basically, these users will be, this function getUsers is called in our resolvers file, right? And we want to return them in such a way that we get the ID, we get the name, we get the email, and we also get a list of projects that they're involved with. Right. What do we have right now if we look at our GraphQL playground? All right, so we do have the users up to their email, right? We have their ID, their name, their email, but we don't have these projects, right? So that's what we need to do, is we need to make sure we can get these projects. All right, so go to the gist that I have. And the main project that we want to, or sorry, the main function we'll need is a function called getUsers, right? That's going to replace the getUsers function we have now. So go ahead and replace the getUsers function with that. Now, this function relies on other functions, all right? Basically what I want to do is I want to get all of the users from the users table, all right? And once I have that entire list of users, I also want to get all of the assignments from the assignments table. Then I want to go through the whole array of rows from the users table, and for each user, I want to find out if they're attached to an assignment, right? So first, I loop over the users table results, and then for each user I loop over the assignments table results, and I try to see if that user is assigned to a specific project. Once I do, right, I can go ahead and add that project information to this array called projects, all right? But before I can do that, right, and I've defined that array right here, before I can do that, I need to define these functions here. All right, so first let's get the function getUsers from users table in the gist, or from the gist. Here we are. All right, and that's a function that we might reuse, so let's put it towards the top. We'll put it under find user by email. Actually, let's put it above that. It's less specific. And you can see this is a very simple function. We're just using this simple SQL query right here. We're getting all of the rows from the users table, right? And then we're returning them. Okay, so in our get users function, that's handled here. So that's taken care of. Now we need to get the assignments, or all of the assignments, from the assignments table. And that's this function right here. So go ahead and put that right below get users from users table. And you can probably name your functions better than I can, so feel free to do that. All right, so we're using a little bit of a kind of sophisticated SQL query here to consolidate or combine our data based on the relationships between the tables. All right, so we're getting these column values, right? So from the assignments table, we're getting user ID. From the users table, we're getting their name, right? Because we need their ID, we need their name. Right? We're also getting from the assignments table the project ID, right? And we're getting that so we can look up the project in the project table, right? And also from the projects table, we want to return the title of the project and the status, right? So this will give us all the information we need for our users project list. Right, so from the users table, we want to do an inner join on the assignments table on these values, or this column, where the values here equal the values here, right? And they will because of that foreign key relationship we set up. And then from there, we take that and do an inner join on the projects, where the values here equal the values here. Okay, and you might need to take some time to look at that if you're not too familiar with SQL. That's fine. You know, once we're done with the video, I encourage you to go back and do that. But for now, we're just going to move forward. All right, so this gets returned again to our get users function. All right, so that removed that error we were getting here. So again, now that we have all of the users and all of the assignments, right, which this actually is not just the assignments, but it's also the project information, right, because we did that inner join on the projects table, right? We loop over all the users, all right, then we create, for each user we create an empty array of objects, right, which actually should be a user, right? We should call this a user type, but again, because we're going to probably change the shape of the user type in the database over time, we don't want to have to go back and change this every time. We want to change it just one time when we finally got it nailed down. So we'll leave it as it is. So anyway, we create this empty array of projects, and then for each user we loop over that value that we got here in assignments, which included the project ID, the username, the project title, and the project status, right? And once we find a match between the user ID for this user here and the user from the assignment table, then we know that user is attached to that project, and we take that project info that we got through the inner join and we add it here, right? We create an object with these three properties, we give it these values, and we push it to this projects array. Once we've got all those pushed to the array, we'll want to do is we'll want to return a user object that's in exactly this shape right here. Right, so we type the user here, so we're returning it in exactly that shape. Right, and you can see the first three properties we've been using already, right? But the last property is that array of objects. We add that too. Right? And basically, because we're mapping over this users from users table, right, and just returning these values inside of a user object or as a user object, we can push that object to the array that we're creating from the mapping called users, right? And then we just return that array, right? And that should give us what we need when it gets passed through our resolvers to our GraphQL endpoint. Right, so that should be everything we need. All right, and just to make clear on what's going on here, right? We're getting the data from the database, right? And that's what we're doing here and here, right? In fact, after we get it from the database, with this one here, we're combining things a little bit into the shape that we want them to be, or the shape that we want our data to be in, using this SQL query here. But that's not enough. So we're finally working things into this shape right here, not because it matches this, and I made a mistake earlier. I said it should match exactly this. It doesn't. Not because it matches this. Forget about that. But because it matches this right here. This is what we want to return, right? Minus the password, of course, right? But it needs to be in this shape before it gets passed to our resolver and then sent to our GraphQL endpoint. All right, so that was a lot of talking. So let's just go ahead and see if we can get all of our values through a query in our GraphQL playground. All right, so I'll go ahead and refresh, run the query, and you can see that we get our projects for each user, right? So Octavio has his projects, both 1 and 2, and Farah has her projects, both 1 and 3, plus all of the other information that we were already returning. Okay, so I'm sure you're tired by the end of this video. I know I am. But this is how it works with GraphQL. You know, you have to get your data from wherever you're getting your data from. You need to put it into the shape that your type definitions, your GraphQL type definitions tell you need to put it in. And then you can pass all of that to a resolver, and then that will get funneled to your GraphQL endpoint. But since we're using TypeScript, right, we have to be extra careful that we're typing things correctly before we ever get it into the shape that it needs to be in for our GraphQL type definitions. I know that's a lot to parse, but please do take some time to go over this video, maybe watch it once or twice, and then go over the data or go over the code until it makes sense. One thing I will say is that this is not the final code that we're going to end up with, not by a long shot. In fact, it's more effective to use an ORM than to just write all these queries out yourself and do everything in such a bare bones style. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to show you at a very fundamental level what you need to be thinking about as you create your GraphQL endpoint, as you create your data graph. So anyway, that's it for this video, and I'll be putting up another video hopefully in the near future. All of the code that we got from the gist you'll be able to get because I'll post a link to that gist in the description below the video. So as always, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.